And what they're saying is that the villages of that region have existed for many, many generations, long before Israel occupied the West Bank in 1967. And so with this renewed focus specifically on Masafer Yatta, but West Bank generally, we thought that it was a really good opportunity to have this broader discussion about what's happening in West Bank and East Jerusalem as well. And we're very fortunate to have with us Ruvi Ziegler, who is a law professor, and he can guide us through kind of the legal and political complexities of this area. So just to introduce Ruvi is a British-Israeli law professor at Reading. He chairs there the LGBTQIA plus staff network. He's also a senior research associate at Oxford's Refugee Studies Centre and the London's Refugee Law Initiative. And he's the chair of the charity New Europeans UK. Ruvi specializes in refugee law, international humanitarian law, and the relations between citizenship and political rights. So, Ruvi, thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Pleasure.
And I'm going to be honest and say that I'm really not an expert on this, so I'm here to learn. I think maybe like many other people who also joined. And we thought it would be a good place to start is with some numbers, kind of what's really happening in the West Bank, and specifically if we look at the numbers of the settler population in the West Bank.
Absolutely, yeah. So welcome everyone, and it's great to see a lot of familiar faces, but also many others. And we are recording this, so we'll share this with people registered, so that you can share it further, of course, as well. So I think I will start with kind of a general question, and maybe even do it in a participatory way. Without people Googling, because that's obviously sorts out the issue. How many settlers do you think were in the West Bank? Let's exclude East Jerusalem. We'll talk about East Jerusalem later. When the first kind of proper change in government happened in Israel in 1977, and Menachem Begin became prime minister. So this is 10 years after Israel seized the West Bank. In 1967. So let me give just 30 seconds, just put in without looking online, a general estimate of how many people do you think were settlers in the West Bank then? And then we'll talk about where they were and where we are now. So the chat, I think, is open. So anyone wants to risk an educated guess? Is that John? Is that 100,000 or 100 individuals? 1,000. Okay, interesting. Right. So 20,000 from Mark. Yeah. So the correct figure. Actually, you guys were broadly in the correct ballpark. We're talking about 8,000 people who were in the West Bank in 1977. The number now is about 500,000, right? So I'll just share a slide that shows the progression of settlers by year, right? It is small and it is in Hebrew, but you don't need to be able to read the headline to see what's happening here, right? So this is 1977. This is where we are now. And you can see the massive jump, and in fact, a huge jump in the last 15 years or so. So if you compare 2009, 2008 to today, it's almost doubled from about 260,000 in 2006 to over 500,000. And this, as I say, excludes East Jerusalem, where there was a similar big jump in terms of neighborhood. So today, if you combine the two, East Jerusalem has about 250,000 nearly Jews who live in the areas that have become part of Israel in Jerusalem, that Israel annexed in 1967. But we're part of the West Bank in 1967. So from an international law perspective, and we'll come to that later, are part of the occupied West Bank. And an additional 500,000 West Bank. So we're talking about 750,000 people. Now, I'll do one other participatory game, which is to ask you to name the biggest settlement. That's kind of a more advanced kind of enterprise. So I don't know if anyone has any guesses. So again, this isn't a neighborhood in East Jerusalem, but a settlement in the West Bank, etc. So Ma'ale Adumim is a very good guess, but it's not Ma'ale Adumim. Thank you, Mark. And Ariel is actually much smaller, and quite interestingly so. Although it is one of the cities. So there are 4 cities in the West Bank that have been designated as cities by the Israeli state. The top 2, by a huge margin, are ultra-Orthodox Haredi cities called Modi'in Ilit, which is next to Modi'in, which is inside Israel, and Beitar Ilit, which is next to Beitar, which is inside Israel. And Modi'in Ilit has 81,000 people. Beitar Ilit has 73,000 people. So between the 2 of them, just those 2 cities have about 1/3 of the entire settler population. And these are Orthodox or Haredi population. More generally, Haredi make up about half of the settlers, the West Bank, which is something that I think people do not realize, and they virtually made 0 of the number of settlers in 1977. Granted, it was a very small number, but the original settlers involved no one from the Haredi community. And the story of how Haredis have found the West Bank, or as it were, how the West Bank has become a cheaper, subsidized place for people to move to who cannot afford housing for big families inside Israel, and hence gets them either in the additional neighborhoods in East Jerusalem, which are mostly also Haredi, or if they can't afford that, in the West Bank itself, is one of the biggest stories of the settlement movement. The original settlers, so to go back to 1977, the first 10 years, those 8,000 settlers were primarily, almost exclusively, in areas in the Jordan Valley, where those were agricultural kind of settlements. So this is the area just next to Jordan. These were secular settlers, socialist settlers in many instances. And a small number of settlers in the original movement have returned, you can say, and I think in a legitimate way, to Gush Etzion, which was the one area in the West Bank where there were Jews in 1948. There were a few settlements of when the Israeli state was formed, and there were a few small settlements re-established in 1960, between 1967 and 1977. In addition to that, the Jewish settlement inside Hebron was set up in 1968, initially as putting one foot inside the door, as you were, to just go there for one Passover in 1968. And from that, things have escalated in the way they have. So this is, I think, the initial entry point for our discussion, is that the settler movement looks entirely different today, demographically, numbers-wise, than it did when Likud took power in 1977, and that the type of places they live in have also changed dramatically.
Okay. Thank you. I think it's really astonishing to see the graph. Thank you for sharing it to us. And you kind of started doing this already, but can we sort of go back, and could you walk us through the key events, whether they're political or legal events, that kind of shape the growth of these settlements, probably post 1967 is that
Yeah, absolutely. So as I said, the Israeli state decided not to annex the West Bank, with the exception of essentially enlarging what was a very small Israeli Jerusalem in on the day the West Bank was seized in 67. And Jerusalem grew, I think, about 4 or 5 fold in size as a result of the annexation. But with the exception of that area around Jerusalem, it's referred to as East Jerusalem, but in fact, it's North, East, and South Jerusalem. Those are then engulfed from all directions. The rest of the West Bank remain under military occupation, and the original position, I think, and I may be doing injustice to the labor movement, but the labor movement's position, as I understand it, before I was born in the 1970s, was to see settlements as a strategic buffer between Israel and Jordan. Remember, at that time, no peace with Jordan, and Jordan was seen still as a threat. 67, Jordan was part of the war, 73 wasn't, but to try and build a few settlements that will be alongside the Jordan Valley and potentially build a few more to kind of enlarge what are like the narrow hips, as they often refer to, of Israel, or thighs, kind of near and north of Tel Aviv. But there was no appetite at all for what was referred to as ideological or religiously driven settlements. And the very few attempts that were made to build those settlements were dealt with force robustly. So there were a number of attempts by the original kind of body that is now known as the Yesha Council, was Gush Emunim, the settler, the kind of more Orthodox driven religious movement, to try and build various settlements in the mid 1970s, very famously a fairly violent kind of removal of people in Sebastia, near Nablus in 1975. And there were no settlements in those areas at all, near the big Palestinian cities, near Nablus, near Jericho, near Bethlehem, with the exception, as I say, of some settlements in Gush Etzion. And the big shift happened in 1977 with a change in government that took a very different approach ideologically to the West Bank. And that has led to the first interesting legal moment, but also with great implications longer term, which is in legal terms, you call it the Dawikat judgment, but it was related to the attempt to seize private Palestinian land in order to build a settlement called Elon Moreh, also near Nablus. And the Israeli Supreme Court, which we'll come to, I know, a bit later, said you can't seize Palestinian land to build a settlement unless you can show us you're doing it for security reasons, and you haven't shown us you've done it for security reasons. And this has led to this famous statement by the then Israeli Prime Minister: there are judges in Jerusalem. We need to respect the ruling, even though we disagree with the ruling. And so this supposedly was a setback for the settler movement, because you could no longer just use Palestinian private land to confiscate it or capture it in order to build Israeli settlement. But what has unfolded since was a move, which some may characterize as a pernicious move, to capture land that is referred to in colloquially as state land, right? Essentially land that cannot be traced to an individual Palestinian owner, or that has been uncultivated and uninhabited, and so is being declared to be land that can be used for general public service purposes, and then to utilize that type of land, which is then no longer private land or was never private land, to build settlements on it. And so the vast majority of settlements have been built on so-called state land. But of course, one can ask the question, whose state is this and whose land is this, right? And to whose purposes was this land meant to transpire, and that was led by a very famous person in the legal department in the Ministry of Justice called Plia Albeck, and so there was a huge movement in the 1980s to declare large swath of lands as so-called state land, and that includes lands in the south of the West Bank, including the areas around Masafer Yatta, which Jenny mentioned at the start of the talk. Large parts of those lands were declared as state land and then made into so-called firing zones for the military. Ultimately, not to build settlements directly on them, but to make sure Palestinians don't enter them and they become effectively buffer zones between Israel in many cases and the big Palestinian cities. And so alongside that, we have these big cities being established, including Haredi cities, as I've mentioned earlier. And the last settlement actually to have been formally declared a settlement in the West Bank was back in 1991. So the last 30 years actually have not seen the establishment of new settlements. What has happened in the last 30 years is the creation of what's referred to as outposts or agricultural farms, right? Which are not regularized formally by the Israeli state because they were never set up in a government decision as was the requirement for new settlements, but have been effectively tolerated with the exception of a short period in the mid 2000s following a report by the then I think the equivalent of the director of public prosecution, Talia Sasson, the famous Outposts report, has pointed to the need to deal with those outposts. And so there was a short period under Ariel Sharon when there was thought that those might be dealt with. In reality, and I'll share another graph just to show you when those outposts have been built. These are things that were built arguably without the government directly pushing for them, but doing it with a wink and a nod, right, on the side. And you can see actually quite remarkably, there was a period under Ariel Sharon and then under Olmert, and then even in the early kind of return days of Netanyahu, when outposts were not built. And many of the outposts were built in the late 1990s, but the big push, and again, I think this is something that has actually gone under the radar, partly because of October 7th, was the last 2 years. So just look at this data. There were 90 new outposts built in the West Bank just in the last year and a half, more than virtually in the entire previous 50 odd years. And that tells you another story because those outposts are strategically scattered, essentially to encircle many of the Palestinian cities and villages and to make it nearly impossible for them to expand and to grow. I think those are the main kind of milestones, but we can talk, we can talk much more about these further.
Definitely, and thank you. Just to say, if you, the audience, have any questions or comments, please feel free to use the chat and write them down. And I am monitoring the chat, so I'll be able to read your comments and questions. And we really want to make this conversational. So this distinction between settlements and outposts, which is it's supposed to be, settlements are, my understanding is they're supposed to be legal in the view of the Israeli court, while the outposts are not. So, and then you show us this graph where kind of under the radar, or however you call it, there's a huge number of outposts that are supposed to be illegal. So how does that actually, how does that happen? Why are they still there? Why aren't they evicted?
Yeah. No, those are all very good questions. Look, the reality is this. So just the first point is around legality, and I think we might come later to this time to discuss the what I would call the widening gap between the the views around the application of certain elements of international law as developed in Israeli institutions, including the Israeli Supreme Court, where I think, unlike the role that it plays inside Israel in pre-67 Israel, which is quite fundamental to maintaining the rule of law and to stopping government excesses, it's hard to give it a similar mark in relation to the West Bank, and fundamentally a lot of the problems in relation to judgments of the Israeli Supreme Court over the years go back to this very key question of the legality of settlements. And it's not as if the court hasn't been invited on several occasions, as early as 1972, but in a very pointed petition by Peace Now, one of the civil society organizations in Israel, in 1991, invited to essentially find what Theodore Meron, mind you, later a judge of the International Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia, a very prominent international lawyer, but between 1967 and 1971, the legal advisor of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Israel has said in an opinion that was later published, many years later, that it's very unequivocal that settlements are illegal under international law and so should not be established. That was an opinion that he rendered in early on after the start of the occupation. But the Israeli Supreme Court has refused to take a similar stance. It has never attempted to say settlements do not breach international law. It has simply deemed this question to be what lawyers call non-justiciable, or a political question. It's a question for politicians to deal with, rather than a question for the court to deal with, even though it's very evidently not just a political question. Of course, it is a political question, but it's also very clearly a legal question. And that has led to all sorts of issues arising as a result of the settlements being there. Because if you've got a settlement there and it's getting threatened and settlers get stones thrown at their cars and people are trying to infiltrate settlements and kill people, then you need settlements to be surrounded by security fences, and you need outposts for the military to protect the settlements, and you need the whole separation barrier to take into account settlements, and you need electricity and water and other things, and you need the whole infrastructure then becomes contingent on the settlements being there. And as a result, the Supreme Court, when he was looking at every one of those issues, didn't go back to square one and say, well, hold on, should we even have settlements? It assumed the settlements are there, and that's not for discussion. Now, and as a result, kind of dealt with the other issue. Now, that's very different than the view of the International Court of Justice, and I would say virtually every other international institution that takes the view that settlements are illegal. And so, to the extent there are threats to settlements, then the solution is for the settlements not to be there, rather than to add insult to injury by making it harder for individual Palestinians to continue to live in the West Bank. The outposts are a fascinating phenomenon, right? Because the origins of the outposts is in the 1990s. Why? Because the Rabin government, I should say the second Rabin government. So Rabin in 1970s was the Rabin who evacuated or did not allow Sebastia to be formed because he didn't support ideological settlements. The Rabin of the 1990s took a position that we're not going to build any new settlements. And so the settlement movement thought, well, the solution to this is to create facts on the ground and to assume that the state would just budge and essentially realize that if you've got people living there in a caravan and with a water tank, and they need to be protected because you don't want a headline and you also don't want people to be killed if they don't have security, you're going to provide them security, you're going to connect them to electricity, and so as a result, you're going to end up with that effectively becoming regularized without it having gone through any of the proper channels through the government, and in some cases with those outposts being clearly on private land, right? So the rare occasions where there were attempts, and in some instances successful attempts, to evacuate outposts, where it was evidently the case that they were built on private Palestinian land. So people may remember actually Prime Minister Netanyahu in 2017 evacuating quite violently in that case Amona, which was a outpost very near the settlement of Ofra. And that was a case where, having gone through the Israeli Supreme Court, it was clear that this was Palestinian private land, and the Palestinian did not agree to it being taken away from them, and was not willing to be offered any form of compensation for it in order to allow it to remain, which were some of the attempts that were made. But with the exception of very short periods of time when the Israeli government has either cracked down on outposts or has been forced to because they were on private land, we can see the mushrooming is very evident and is very linked to particularly to very right-wing Israeli government, right? So there was this gap in the late 2000, early 2010s when no new outposts were built, because the early stages of which you built an outpost are the easiest stages to dismantle it, right? So if you just put on a caravan, at that stage you can remove it. Once things have been settled, once there's a school, not that it stopped the demolition of the school in Masafer Yatta, and for people who saw the film, etc. But once you've got a school, once you've got buildings, once you've got generators, it's much more difficult to do it, right? So that's why in the periods when there was a less favorable Israeli government, there were no outposts being built. That's probably why the last 2 years have seen this mushrooming of outposts.
So I think especially when we have a government with people like Smotrich
Hmm.
and Ben-Gvir, who's not in the government but still
Hmm.
obviously very active, I assume that has an impact on sort of the likelihood of Israel doing something about these illegal outposts.
Yeah, I see there's a question from Mark about the larger outposts being linked to roads that cannot be used by Palestinians. So, yeah, so look, I mean, that opens a wider question around why, why the International Court of Justice has recently opined in its advisory opinion that the whole presence of Israel in the West Bank has now become illegal on its view, because the level of violations of different norms of international law, including the norm that prohibits the creation of settlements and then prohibits further the creation of a two-tier system of law within one territory for two populations. One manifestation of that two-tier system that exists in the West Bank is the roads system, right? So there are roads that are effectively inaccessible to Palestinians. Some of them lead directly to settlements. So the main arteries of the West Bank are accessible to Palestinians. So the historic road number 60, which actually was built in the Mandate era, the British Mandate era. So you can see parts of it still in Israel itself, and then going through the main cities of the main strand of the West Bank, so Jenin, then Nablus, then Ramallah, then going through East Jerusalem, and then to Bethlehem and to Hebron. That road is accessible in the main, and various others, but there are quite a few roads that are not. And the difficulty with the outpost is actually more profound in relation to access to agricultural lands than it is in relation to roads. So the main effect of the outpost is that it makes it often dangerous for Palestinian farmers to access their own land, because it's the nature of people who go and are willing to live often for a long time in quite, you know, unsavory conditions in an outpost, right? Just in a caravan somewhere on the hilltop with very little facilities, is that they are genuinely ideological, and their ideology is such that they do not want Palestinians near them, and so they tend to be involved in a lot of the skirmishes with Palestinians, and particularly with Palestinian farmers. And that's true, by the way, again, also in the south of the Hebron Hills areas. So near to Masafer Yatta is one of those areas where that's been the case. I mean, to the level where the Israeli Supreme Court, in quite astounding judgment back in 2002 or 2003, has ordered the Israeli military, which it still does every year now, to accompany Palestinian farmers to their land to harvest the olives in September, October each year, because they have been harassed by Israeli settlers rather, when they were doing so. So there was a petition by ACRI, by the Israeli Association for Civil Rights, that demanded that the military essentially do its job, which is to protect the population in the West Bank. And the court, that was one of the instances where the court intervened in a good way, right? So we may come to instances where it hasn't, but on that occasion it has, to protect settlements or to protect Palestinians from settlers, essentially.
And is it also kind of, we've talked about numbers and the growing number of settlers and the growing number of outposts, and I think it's safe to say that there's been also a growing violence of settlers
Yeah,
towards Palestinians, right? Um,
I think so. Yeah. Well, I mean, it's actually the last year and a half have been, ultimately, I think it's difficult to describe it other than the military essentially being non-present, right? So I think that the difference, ultimately, the trajectory of the military relations with the settler movement is, I think, from a point in the 1970s where there were very few settlements. Those that were in the Jordan Valley were not trying to be hostile to Palestinians necessarily, were built in really arid land, and the military was trying to prevent. The military had a different composition as well. Um, Gradually getting to a point where where much of the military infrastructure in the West Bank is comprised of settlers who live in settlements. I mean, that is just it's an empirical point, right? You look at who the main commanders of the main um, um, branches of the military in large parts of the West Bank, and they come from the settler movement now. And that obviously changes the dynamic of how the military interacts with settlements. But I think since October 7th, there has been a fundamental kind of willingness to essentially allow settlers to get away with things that they didn't before. Again, on the assumption that even if it ends up in the courts or something, then the courts would not be as willing to intervene as they were prior to October 7th.
yeah. So I want to move to slightly different topic related to that, just because I'm conscious of the time.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's really, I think, like, if when we're talking about the West Bank, it's really important to talk about the Oslo Accords.
Yeah.
And so essentially the Oslo Accord, which were supposed to be like, that was supposed to be a temporary
Mm,
phase, right? That would ultimately lead to a permanent solution and a Palestinian state, and things didn't go as planned. Let's put it this way. And it's sort of like this reality just is completely frozen. Um, so if we talk about kind of the Oslo, the division, the territorial division, the areas A, B, C, if you could just walk us through that, and also just explain how this different classification to areas A, B, C, and in Hebron, H1 and H2, like what does it mean, practically speaking, and what does like the everyday life of Israelis and Palestinians who live there, what do their lives basically look like?
Yeah, sure. I saw, by the way, I saw the question, and that's sort of there's a question in the chat around kind of Jews and living in Judea and Samaria and the West Bank. I'm happy to just to kind of I won't shy away from answering this, but let me answer what Jenny was asking about, and we can come back to that question. Thanks for asking it. Um, as you mentioned, the Oslo Accords were intended to be a temporary 5-year um, agreement, right? So 5 years from what was referred to as Oslo A, which was agreed in May 1994. So we all remember before that, Rabin and Arafat shaking hands with Clinton in the White House on the 13th of September 1993. Many of us remember the moment quite vividly, and that was a declaration of principles, and that led to two specific accords. The one that was called kind of Gaza First, quite you know interestingly, or Gaza and Jericho first, which led Arafat to come from exile as you were in Tunis to rule Gaza, but initially just with Jericho in 1994, and then the big Oslo move was the September 1995 move, right? That's the move that generated the mass demonstrations inside Israel that ultimately led to the assassination of the Israeli Prime Minister Rabin on the 4th of November 1995. And that's when the West Bank got divided for the purposes of that temporary period until the final arrangements are negotiated. And the final arrangements were supposed to include discussions around Jerusalem, around refugees, around borders, around settlements, and around water, right? The 5 core permanent status issues. In the interim, Palestinians were to be given a form of self-government that was divided into 3 kind of types of layers. And again, I'll use a map to illustrate. It's quite a difficult map to encapsulate, right? But you can try and make out of this map the darker shaded kind of I don't know what color it is, like brownish areas, which are the big Palestinian cities, ultimately, which are area A, the other kind of yellow covered, kind of dotted with red, which is area B, and the rest, which is 60%, which is area C. So 18% area A, 22% area B, and 60% area C. Area A is where the big Palestinian cities are, where the majority of the Palestinian population are. B is where most Palestinian villages are. And Area C is where all of the settlements are, the Israeli settlements. Some Palestinians, because of the way the map was designed, it was impossible to avoid having Palestinians in Area C as well, and all of the various military bases. In terms of the division of numbers, so we know now there's something in the order of 3 million Palestinians. So the vast majority of those Palestinians live in, say, 40% of the territory, and the 500,000 settlers plus a few 100,000 Palestinians live in the rest of the 60%. So, that already tells you a little bit of the story around how the demography played a role in dividing the territory. But fundamentally, the division was that in areas A, where Palestinians have their big cities, they have control over their lives in all civic matters, and also in terms of security, policing, and internal security. The external security matters, so anything that relates to Israelis or a risk to Israelis, remained under Israeli control, and Israel retained the right in the Oslo Agreement to do something called a hot pursuit. So to be able to chase someone into areas A and to, as a result, enter it. In B, security was shared, whereas the civic matters were left to the Palestinians. And in Area C, which is where all the settlements are, but as I said, also a few 100,000 Palestinians that live near those settlements, uh, the planning laws, which are critical for things like the issues discussed in the Masafer Yatta, in the No Other Land film, were left in Israeli hands, right? So fundamentally, Palestinians, those limited number of Palestinians who live in Area C they get their schooling and some of their other services generally from the Palestinian Authority, but many aspects of their civic life remain governed by by Israel, and that encapsulated 60% of the land, including, as I say, all of the Jordan Valley, virtually, as you can see from the map, and large other parts of the West Bank. In Hebron specifically, the Hebron arrangement came a little bit later. It came in 1997 under Netanyahu. Some of us are old enough to remember that story of Bar-on Hebron, right? So it all often things do seem like they come back in circles. But there was a point at which the first Netanyahu government was about to appoint a new attorney general. And the leader of the Shas party, who's again in government now, Aryeh Deri, was accused of various corruption charges. And the attempt was to get them, Netanyahu at that time, a very different Netanyahu in terms of his ideology maybe, was trying to get Shas to vote for the ceding ultimately of parts of the control over Hebron, which is what he wanted to negotiate with Yasser Arafat to have an agreement, in return for him agreeing to have this favorable attorney general for Shas, right? And that was the Bar-on Hebron scandal. So it's the interesting thing is that Netanyahu in the 1997 period, for various reasons, wanted to have an agreement with the Palestinians, and that agreement was to divide the city of Hebron. Ultimately, the areas where the settlements, the Israeli settlements in Hebron remain H2, which is an Akin status to being in Area C, and that includes the tomb of the patriarchs, or that includes the settlements that are outside the municipal boundaries of Hebron, but also Jewish presence in various specific areas of Hebron, and the rest of Hebron became H1. So the lives of the Palestinians, in Area C, really follow the analysis that I think I presented a little bit earlier. It's that when you had Israeli governments that were not willing to turn a blind eye to settler violence, when there were far few settlers, when the military was operating in a different way. So if we go back, I don't know, to the 90s, then the lives of Palestinians in Area C were not necessarily bad. The lives of Palestinians in Area C today, I think, are very difficult. They're checkered by all of those factors I've described. Plus, for many of them who have agricultural lands on the so-called Israeli side of the separation barrier, and that applies to a lot of people in the West Bank. Then access to those lands is also restricted, and so the ordinary lives. I often talk about this, in comparison in relation to myself. Someone my sort of age, in the mid 40s, would have been born into the occupation, would have never been in a position where, in order to travel abroad, certainly, but even often within the West Bank, they were able to do so without getting a permit from an Israeli commander, and for many other aspects of their lives, would be living in a situation where the lives are dictated by ultimately law that they have no part in making, right? Because they're not citizens of territories that are under occupation. That is the nature of the regime. And yeah, I think that really is the core issue of what is now a 50 coming up to a 58-year-old occupation.
Okay. Thanks, Ruvi. Do you want to address the question from the chat?
Yes, absolutely. So, look, I think that relates. So I don't know what the S stands for. So the question from surname is Gold. So the question says, when did it become considered illegal for Jews to live in Judea and Samaria? So I think the first point to say is that it's not illegal for Jews to live in Judea and Samaria. It's illegal for, under international law, as long as Israel is an occupying force in the West Bank, to have parts of its population, which is mostly Jewish, but it theoretically could settlers could be non-Jews as well from Israel, move into the West Bank as long as that area remains under occupation. And the logic for that is very simple, because once you do that, then you end up exactly with the situation where we end up now, where you've got two populations in the same territory. One of them is the population of the occupying power and are citizens of that state and are able to influence its policies and are subject to a civilian set of laws that are passed by the Israeli parliament to a large extent. And the other population is subject to military rule and has no political say in its governance. And the bigger kind of rationale for not allowing settlements in Article 49.6 of the Fourth Geneva Convention is because changing the demographic makeup of the territories that you occupy is the first step you take towards trying ultimately to influence the sovereignty over that territory. And occupation is not supposed to transfer sovereignty. Occupation is a temporary regime that's supposed to end up ultimately with an agreement where sovereignty returns to those who were its original occupants. Uh, and so it's not that Jews per se, because they're Jews, can't move to the West Bank. Is that Israelis can't there can't be Israeli settlements in the West Bank when that area is under occupation, in the same way that Russia can't transfer part of its population into Crimea, which is occupied, or Turkey can't transfer part of its population into the northern part of Cyprus. Morocco can't transfer people to Western Sahara. You can't transfer parts of your own population into an occupied territory. That is a fundamental rule in international law, and it's that rule which is a point that I wanted to make more generally, which has led ultimately to the International Court of Justice to now find the entire presence of Israel in the West Bank to be illegal, because the notion that you occupy a territory is not in itself illegal in international law. So international law recognizes that occupation is a factual thing, right? You have the presence of a hostile military in a territory, unwelcome, uninvited by the local population, and it controls that area. That is an occupation, and from that follow a set of rules in international law. What is and so historically, no one would have made the claim in the 70s or 80s that the mere fact that there's an Israeli occupation breaches international law. What has now led the International Court of Justice to take that position in July last year is because it no longer perceives it credible to suggest that this occupation is temporary. It simply does not accept, or the majority of the judges, I should say, it was a 12-3 decision on this particular point. The majority of judges do not think there is a credible or sensible argument anymore to say that the Israeli presence in the West Bank is temporary and not intended to be permanent. And if it's intended to be permanent, then that becomes illegal, because an occupation cannot be permanent. And that relates to the point about Jews living there. So is there a scenario in the future where you've got an arrangement or an agreement between Palestinians and Israelis, either for two states or another arrangement that the two peoples agree, where Jews can live in the West Bank? I don't see a fundamental reason why not. In fact, I would think that would be even desirable if you could reach an agreement where you don't have to evacuate all of the settlements. But that has to be done in agreement with the people whom, under international law, have the right to sovereignty over that territory.
So actually on that point, and you've mentioned the Fourth Geneva Convention, and I guess if we talk about the gap between the Israeli
Mm,
courts and the international courts, my understanding is that that is kind of where it all begins, and it's how
mm,
you interpret it. And Israel essentially doesn't even see this as occupied territory, but as a disputed territory. Um,
yes.
so can you talk a bit about that, about sort of how do the Israeli court interpret it in relation to both East Jerusalem and West Bank, and then the conflict with the international courts?
Yeah, so East Jerusalem's the easier point in the sense that once it was annexed under Israeli law, then because Israeli law or primary law, so in this case, a law passed by the Knesset, it's now also basic law, Jerusalem, capital of Israel, which kind of enshrines this. Because that exists, that trumps Israel's international obligations, which were not made, like the Geneva Convention, which were not made themselves into Israeli law by the Knesset, but are things that Israel has signed and is committed to internationally. And so East Jerusalem, from the Israeli Supreme Court's perspective, is part of Israel. They say from the international community's perspective, is part of the West Bank. It is, by the way, anecdotally why, with all the talk about moving American and other embassies to Jerusalem, one should note that no embassy has been moved to East Jerusalem, right? So whatever embassy has been moved, they've been moved to West Jerusalem. No country has an embassy or consulate in relation to Israel in East Jerusalem because that is not recognized as part of Israel by no country fundamentally. Um, so the West Bank's a different story, right? Because Israel has signed the Geneva Conventions, and they exist, right? The question was how do you apply them? And the position the Israeli state took in early on in the case law, back in the late 60s, early 70s, in the first cases, was that it accepts that he would follow the provisions of the Geneva Conventions without accepting that the territory is occupied. Fundamentally, it was based, and this gets too technical, I think, for an audience that's not lawyery, but it is premised on a very kind of conventional interpretation of a provision in the Geneva Convention of Article 2 that suggested because Jordan, which previously held this territory, was also not the sovereign in that territory, then having seized it from Jordan means that it's disputed and not occupied. The interpretation that the vast majority of international lawyers, the international community takes, is that what defines the territory as occupied is the population. The population in the territory is not the population of the militaries that has entered that territory. So Jordan has occupied the West Bank. That is correct for the years he was there. And Israel is now the occupier in the West Bank. And the question of who has legitimate sovereignty over that territory or whether you've taken it from the legitimate sovereign doesn't affect the application of the law. And again, the logic for that is very clear because if you didn't apply this, then states would utilize the fact that there's a dispute over who the territory belonged to deny the protections that Geneva Conventions give to the population, to the people there. And so the Israeli Supreme Court, because the state ultimately has said over the years, we will follow the Geneva Conventions, then the Israeli Supreme Court never determined the the question whether it's an occupied territory, but it applied the laws of occupation to it, right? Or the laws of belligerent occupation, as it's referred to, which is a real sophistry type of move, right? And one that is contentious, right? As I say, a body like the International Court of Justice takes a very clear view that this is occupied territory. It has also led the Israeli Supreme Court on various instances to adopt very awkward interpretations of international law in relation to the Geneva Convention. So most infamously in relation to two areas, There were judgments in the 1980s and 1990s that allowed Israel to deport individual Palestinians from the West Bank abroad, to primarily to Lebanon, on the grounds that the interpretation was that individual deportations don't breach the Geneva Conventions, even though the text of the Geneva Convention is very clear and talks about either individual or collective deportations, and also in relation to house demolitions for deterrence purposes, which are prohibited in the Geneva Conventions. The court relied on some other provisions in actually British mandate law that remain part of Israeli law for various reasons to justify that. So the Israeli Supreme Court has a checkered history in relation to applying international law. It sometimes applied it reasonably, as in the example I've given earlier in relation to having a duty to accompany farmers to their land, right, based on provisions of the Geneva Convention, so very explicitly. Sometimes it applies it in a haphazard way, like in relation to the separation barriers, in some cases reasonably, in others not. And sometimes it simply adopted outlandish interpretations, like in relation to deportations or house demolition. Overall, the record isn't great, in my assessment. And the reason is simple. The reason goes back to that fundamental point around the settlements and their unwillingness to decide that point early on. And there's the last point I would make on this is there was a fascinating line. Some of us remember it actually reading it on the day from the then Chief Justice of the Israeli Supreme Court, our Professor Aaron Barak, in 2005, in a case, one of the cases relating to the separation barrier around a settlement in the west of the West Bank called Alfei Menashe. And actually, the court found in that specific instance that the barrier had to be rerouted because it took into account future expansions of the settlement in drawing the line, and that it needs to be closer to where the existing settlement is and not allow for that future expansion. But in the process of explaining why it is okay to protect Alfei Menashe by this barrier, even though it's a settlement, the Aaron Barak says settlements, settlers, even if they live somewhere illegally, are not outlaws. Their right to life is not contingent on whether they're in the territory legally or illegally. Now, he hasn't actually gone quite far in the next sentence as saying, and this is my view, that these settlements are illegal, but the people there need to be protected. But that was the closest hint in an Israeli judgment to essentially recognizing that settlements breach international law.
Interesting. And we're sort of reaching towards the end. So please, if you have questions,
yeah, absolutely.
write them down now. Another question I had was about the separation barrier that was created, and it also, like we obviously there is the legal issue, which and I think you made it very clear. But then there's also the issue of security, right?
Yes.
And I think, and I can speak for myself as an Israeli, who remembers very vividly the 90s and the early 2000s, with terrorist attacks and suicidal bombers, and like the really huge, insane impact it had on our lives, and how scary it was. And then, and so from the Israeli perspective, like the separation barrier, for example, has managed to tackle this problem, right? And so we know that the amount of attacks was reduced dramatically. But at the same time, obviously there are the legal issues. So just was wondering what's your view on that?
No,
how
absolutely.
like in general, it's really hard, I think, but there is this real question of security, right? And then they have to balance it with the law and human rights, and so yeah, just your view on
Absolutely. So just so that people know the kind of reference point, so that's a map of the separation barrier. And if you can see in the I suppose per light purple, right, that goes, it's easy to recognize because it goes into the Dead Sea, right? That is the green line, confusingly not green in this map. And or the armistice lines at in on the 4th of June 1967. And fundamentally, you can see that there are actually some areas in the West Bank where the barrier broadly follows the green line, like say in the southwest bits, right? You can see that it trails it, and it diverges from it in order to include some of the settlements, broadly some of the big settlement blocks um, on the so-called Israeli side. And it's not a coincidence if you look at the map of the barrier as it ended up being constructed, and you look at a map of something, say, like the Camp David Accords, there is a strong resemblance, let's say. So fundamentally, the sort of settlements that Iwo thought would remain on the so-called Israeli side in a peace agreement were also designed to be left on the Israeli side. Now, that tells us various things in terms of the story. So the first thing is that the idea that Israel would, certainly in the circumstances of 2002, when the building was initiated, with massive suicide bombings, including the Park Hotel in Netanya on Seder night and others, which I remember, and was kind of personally not far from several, right? So the idea that Israel would build a barrier on the Green Line, say, would not have been controversial. In fact, I know this because the International Court of Justice said that explicitly in the judgment. It said that if the barrier had been on the Green Line and it had been protecting Israel from infiltrations from the West Bank, it would raise no legal challenges, right? In the sense that there was no assumption that Palestinians have necessarily a right to enter Israel itself or to enter it without permits or without security. The problem with the barrier was the inclusion of parts of the West Bank in the so-called Israeli side, when the perception that the International Court of Justice accepted ultimately in 2004, that even though Israel says this is a temporary barrier, we're not, for instance, confiscating the land in order to build it on private land. We are seizing it, which is a temporary measure where you pay rent to the owner, supposedly. I mean, most Palestinians don't take that rent because they don't want to collaborate or to cooperate with this operation. But in theory, this remains private Palestinian land. It hasn't been confiscated. And we do it temporarily. And if and when we reach an agreement and the route has to change, we will dismantle the barrier, right? That was the argument that was put to the Israeli Supreme Court about the barrier. The International Court did not accept it, and that fundamentally is the big divide between the two courts. So the Israeli Supreme Court, if the International Court had accepted that this is temporary, it might have seen this as legitimate, and if the Israeli Supreme Court had accepted it as permanent, it would have rejected it, right? But both courts, for their different purposes, reached different conclusions. And I think, again, to go back to the point about security, the security of Israelis inside Israel was an entirely legitimate security basis to build a barrier on Israel's border, the same way as there's a barrier on the Israeli-Lebanese border, on the Israeli-Jordanian border, on the Israeli-Egyptian border. That was not in contention. The question whether you protect settlements in the West Bank by quote unquote including them on the Israeli side, leaving as a result large swaths of Palestinian agricultural land on the so-called Israeli side of the barrier, requiring Palestinians to have to go through agricultural gates that have to be opened for them in order to enter and reach their own land, right? That was fundamentally a legal question, which, as I say, the Israeli Supreme Court's approach to was, let's look segment by segment, and some segments were fine and some segments were not fine. The International Court's position was, we zoom out, we look at the map, we know how political maps look. We know what the big settlement blocks look like. We understand this is a form of a land grab of about 8 to 10% of the West Bank, and that's illegal. And that's fundamentally describes the difference. So I think it is important to say there was no rejection of security grounds as a legitimate basis for constructing a barrier on the 67 lines. Not only was there no rejection, there was actually affirmation of that being a legitimate thing to do.
Thank you. Once again, last chance to ask your questions. But again, my last question would be looking forward.
Hmm.
What are the different scenarios that you can envision, Ruvi, as somebody who's kind of
Hmm.
really
Hmm.
knowledgeable in this topic? Yeah, what do you think will happen? Where will it go from here?
Yeah, look, I mean, it's become, yeah, so the wider politics are difficult. Like I think it's become virtually, I think, unimaginable to think of a very large scale evacuation of settlements. I think if we think about the extent to which the evacuation of the nearly 8,000 settlers who were in the Gaza Strip in 2005, and then 4 tiny settlements in the north of the West Bank. In total, I think not more than 2,000 people. So the scale of operation, the kind of public mood that existed then, the huge public support in general. So I think it passed the Knesset by a 5-1 majority roughly, and at the same time how kind of traumatic it was for large parts of the Israeli population, and still probably remains. It's difficult to see it. At the same time, it's difficult to see how any agreement is reached without a sizable evacuation of settlements. And I think the irony is that the harder settlements to evacuate are the ones that are most necessary to evacuate. So, in other words, those big cities, those big ultra-Orthodox cities, somewhere like Modi'in Illit is quite literally, if you think about where the green line is in that area, just on the other side of that green line. You can think about it as an extension, as taking in another couple of miles on that side. And similarly, actually, for Beitar Illit, the story with Ariel is more complicated, but it's only 20,000 people, and there can be potential arrangement there as well. The big cities actually are in some ways easier because they are much nearer to the West Bank, but they're also the sort of places where the people who live there are the ones who moved there because it was cheap and said generally near where they wanted to live. And so if they're offered enough money, theoretically, they might have moved. It's the people who live in those 140 outposts plus probably about 100 of the 140 settlements that are in the middle of the West Bank, so near Nablus, near Jericho, near Ramallah, near Bethlehem. Those are ideological settlers. They're not that many, but there are tens of thousands. And for the life of me, I wish I could say something different, but I do not see how you can have a Palestinian state with those settlements because of all the ideological tensions, for want of other reasons, and I don't see how they can be evacuated in the foreseeable future. And so I suppose my slightly depressing kind of point is to say I don't see at the moment a solution. Yeah. Uh, I see there's a question. Oh, okay. So we've got a response. Thank you. Yeah, in the chat. Should we invite our last call for last orders for questions
Yes, we have about 2 minutes left, so if there are any questions, please ask them now.
or
Uh,
comments?
or
Um,
comments, yes, absolutely. Any thoughts, welcome.
I was
Uh,
I was going to ask one, but you answered it, Ruvi, which was, how many people could be persuaded to move for financial reasons. But you already spoke
mm,
about that, the people and cheap alternative accommodation, but it sounds like what you said is the ideological
Yeah.
settlers are the main issue, really. So
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think, there was a point. I mean, some people may remember him, some people may remember him not particularly fondly for some other things that he was involved in. But there was a point at which one of the leaders of the labor movement, Chaim Ramon, was talking about a scenario where you would need the military to remain in the West Bank for security reasons. And I think perhaps after October 7th, many people take that view. Israel, at least for a certain period, but you don't need the settlements to remain. And so you should have a scheme where you offer settlers, ultimately a form of voluntary repatriation, whilst not fully evacuating the military presence in the West Bank. And there was serious talk about this, I think, in the late 2000s, but it went nowhere politically because he didn't manage to persuade whoever was the prime minister to take this on. There was a window where that might have happened, but as I say, to me, I just don't see a scenario where people who have moved to very ideological spaces where life was not that easy, you would be willing to do that. So,
and we know from the Gaza evacuation just how tricky it is.
yeah.
So we have that as an example. And I think, again, going back to where we started, the numbers that are growing and the number of outposts that keep growing, it just makes it more and more difficult.
Exactly. Yeah, I think that is the reality, right? That it's both the numbers, and I think it's also time, right? So even if we compare today to the disengagement from Gaza and the north of the West Bank, even since then, we've now had 20 years. So essentially almost a generation. So another generation of people who have, there might be now people who were born to people who were born in the West Bank, right? And so it's becoming difficult. And I should say also, without getting into a from the river to the sea discussion, if you look at many maps in Israel, in the Israeli education system, and I dare say in a leading Israeli left-wing newspaper like Haaretz, and you look at the weather map of Haaretz next time you do, I invite you to look and to try and find the green line at Haaretz's weather map, and you will not find it. And in fact, the city that it kind of gives the temperature read for in the West Bank is Ariel, in the center of the West Bank. So it's been normalized to a level where it just seems to me a bit, as I say, I don't want to say naive, because it might be condescending, but I just don't see a scenario, which is why, we had hosted, I think about a year and a bit ago, maybe less than that, a talk about a land for all, right? About an initiative that assumes the settlements are there to stay and still believes in Palestinian sovereignty and believes in essentially sharing the one big space between two sovereign entities, but not requiring evacuations, but having people governed based on their nationality rather than based on where they live. You might say that seems also outlandish at the moment, but that I'm just flagging this as, that there is thinking about what does one do in 2025 with the mere fact that you've got 500,000 settlers, and if you were to include East Jerusalem, another 250,000 people. Is it in any scenario realistic for that to lead to mass evacuation? I think the answer is no.
Okay. Thank you so much, Ruvi. There's another thank you in the chat.
Pleasure.
I had a great time talking to you. We should do it again. Thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed it as well. And we've recorded the session. We'll share the recording so you can share it widely with your friends and family. Yeah, and hopefully we'll see you in the next time. Have a good evening.
Take care, everyone. I'm just going to stop the recording now.
Thanks, Ruvi. Bye.
Thank you, Ruvi.